Hello, my name is Popa, and welcome to my presentation on what does the global coffee market look like? This is a data story that narrates a drill down of the biggest global coffee consumers, as well as dissecting its factors. This is for those who are looking to invest in the coffee industry, as well as for the general public who are curious about where their country stands in the global coffee market. In this presentation, we will be observing the countries that are most successful in the global coffee market and dissecting their factors to identify their defining qualities. This includes variables such as production, consumption, and exportation, as well as the time of year coffee is being produced and the country's GDP per capita. Before we jump into it, here are some key words you should know. GDP per capita is a measure of a country's economic output that accounts for its number of people. The total production is the output manufactured by the country during the calendar year. A country's exportable production is the international trade, whereby the products from the specified country are shipped to another for future sale or trade, while its domestic consumption is the consumption of coffee products where they are produced. Finally, the consumption rate is the consumption of coffee products where they are produced per person. Now, let's get started. This first chart demonstrates a map that shows the country that consumes the most amount of coffee. The darker the color of the country, the higher its domestic consumption is. In this case, Brazil seems to clearly show the most consumption and acts as an outlier. So I've created a separate chart to demonstrate the global comparison. It looks like Indonesia and Yemen seem to be the greatest coffee consumers following Brazil, according to the darkness of the colors representing them. Although Brazil was shown to be the greatest global consumer of coffee, in this map, we see that Ethiopia has the greatest consumption rate per person. This means that on average, people consume more coffee individually in Ethiopia than they do in Brazil from the years of 2017 to 2018. This may be because Ethiopia is clearly a smaller country and less populated, therefore having a higher consumption concentration than Brazil. This chart is a tree map and is being used to demonstrate the most common production months. The size of the boxes demonstrates the production rate, whereas the color represents the months. We can see here that the most popular month to produce coffee is in October, but Brazil, who consumes the most amount of coffee, as seen by the size, produces coffee in April. Here, we can see that the most common consumption month is in April, with Brazil clearly consuming the most. This can mean that Brazil consumes more coffee than they export, knowing that they produce less coffee on average in April than they consume it. When we change the factor from time of year to GDP per capita, we see a completely different type of chart. Here, the size of the box demonstrates its GDP per capita, and the color represents its coffee consumption. We can see here that these variables do not correlate very well. It's hard to see without Brazil being filtered out, but it looks like those with the highest and lowest GDP per capita don't have the highest consumption rates. It appears that those who lie in the middle of the GDP per capita range actually have the highest consumption rates. Now, let's discuss the correlation between a country's exportable production and its GDP per capita. We can also see here, through the scatter plot, that as GDP per capita increases, so does the rates of exportable production per country. This demonstrates how GDP per capita of a country can affect its success in the industry of coffee exports. But when we remove Brazil from the chart, the trend line becomes more constant. This can mean that Brazil is an outlier in this trend, and that GDP per capita doesn't quite affect exportable production, and vice versa. This last chart demonstrates something similar, but this one focuses on how GDP per capita affects a country's total production of coffee and how much is actually exported. Each mark represents a country, and the greater the size and deeper the color the marks are, the higher its GDP per capita. In this case, the countries with the highest and lowest GDP per capita lie closer to the bottom right of the charts and vice versa. This means that countries that lie in the center of the GDP per capita range are more likely to be able to export more of their produced coffee. In conclusion, the global coffee market appears to be ruled by countries in the Southern Hemisphere, mainly Brazil, Colombia, and Ethiopia. But Brazil seems to be the most successful, considering that there is a clear trend between its consumption, exportations, and time of year. It should be considered that although global coffee consumption is highest in Brazil, the consumption rate is highest in Ethiopia. Coffee is most successfully commonly produced in October and is consumed in April. And finally, a country's GDP per capita assists them in the global coffee market as long as they lie in the middle of the range. If one chooses to invest in the global coffee market, then here are some recommendations of mine. When looking at information, understand that Brazil is an outlier and can therefore skew information about trends, but it's a very safe choice. Also, think about the time of year you'd like to invest in and how that can cause fluctuation in the market per country. Finally, I would suggest to look at the annual change in GDP per capita to make sure that the country lies in the sweet spot of success. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation on what does the global coffee market look like. I hope you've learned a little more about the global coffee industry and that it sparked your interest.